Every hospital keeps a room where difficult decisions are made in advance, before anyone in scrubs ever touches a patient. Ours is on the 3rd floor, glass walls, a long table, and no windows facing the outside world, because the ethics committee doesn't want daylight distracting anyone from paperwork that decides who lives. 3 weeks ago, I was sitting at that table, reviewing a compassionate use protocol file, the way I've reviewed 40 others before it, blind to the patient's name, because that's how the committee prefers it done. No bias, no history, just the medicine in front of you. I read the chart, top to bottom. 61-year-old male, end-stage heart failure, no other viable candidates for the trial, and a request that needed the signature of the hospital's senior cardiology consultant within 72 hours, or the protocol would expire and he would die waiting on a transplant list that could not move fast enough to save him. I turned to the last page to sign my own name on the physician of record line, and just above it, in handwriting I recognized before I had even finished reading the letters, was a name I had spent 21 years trying to stop hearing in my sleep. Warren Hollister. The man who put my name on evidence that was never mine and very nearly ended my career before it had properly begun. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. My name is Renee Winters. I'm 43 years old. I'm the director of pediatric cardiology at a children's hospital in Louisville, Kentucky. And until 3 weeks ago, I believed I had made peace with everything that happened in Nashville, Tennessee, the spring I turned 22. I hadn't. Peace is what you tell yourself you've made when the person who hurt you simply disappears instead of ever apologizing. My husband knows the outline of it. A scandal at my first hospital job, an investigation, an acquittal, nobody publicized as loudly as the accusation had been. My children don't know it at all, and when I closed that ethics file and drove home that night, I found myself asking questions I hadn't let myself ask in over 2 decades. Why was Warren Hollister's name attached to a treatment request instead of buried somewhere I'd half hoped it would stay forever? Why did hospital protocol require my signature specifically out of every qualified cardiologist on staff to save the life of the one man who had once tried to take mine? And the question that kept me awake longest of all, if I refused to sign, was I protecting myself from a man who'd already done enough damage, or was I finishing something he started 21 years ago, deciding, without a hearing, without a review board, without a single witness in the room, that Warren Hollister didn't deserve to live? I grew up believing medicine was the one profession where the truth always won eventually, because bodies don't lie the way people do. Symptoms don't have motives. A scan doesn't hold a grudge. I chose pediatric cardiology because children's hearts, more than almost anything else in medicine, tell you exactly what's wrong if you're patient enough to listen. I did not yet understand, at 22, that hospitals are still run by people, and people lie beautifully when the story protects them. I did my residency at a teaching hospital in Nashville, on a cardiac surgery ward that ran a small charitable fund for families who couldn't cover the cost of a child's operation. Warren Hollister ran that fund. He was in his late 30s then, a hospital administrator with a talent for remembering everyone's name and a habit of standing just slightly too close when he spoke to you, so you'd feel flattered before you realized you'd been cornered. I trusted him the way every resident trusts an administrator who seems to be on your side. I had no reason not to. The fund came up $11,000 short during an audit that spring. Someone had been logging donations under a resident login that wasn't theirs, redirecting portions of it to a personal account before the deposits ever reached the hospital's books. The login belonged to me. I hadn't touched that fund in months. I told anyone who would listen that I hadn't done it, and for a while, almost no one listened, because Warren stood in front of the review board with a printed log in his hand and an expression of quiet, reluctant disappointment, and said he'd hoped it wasn't true, but the records didn't lie. They suspended my hospital privileges within a week. My attending stopped making eye contact with me in hallways I'd walked 100 times. My own parents, God rest my mother, asked me gently whether there was anything I needed to tell them, and I understood, hearing the question, that even the people who loved me most were leaving room for the possibility that I'd done it. It took the hospital's internal investigators the better part of a year to trace the login activity to a workstation in the administrative wing that I had never once used. At hours, I could prove I'd been in surgery. I was cleared. Nobody ever printed the word cleared as large as they'd printed the word suspected. Warren Hollister resigned quietly, citing burnout, before anyone could ask him a harder question. And by the time the paperwork caught up to what had actually happened, he was 3 states away, starting over with a clean file and a severance package, and I was rebuilding a reputation from a hospital that had already told an entire city I might be a thief. I left Nashville the following year and never looked back, not once. Not even when old colleagues reached out over the years to tell me things had changed there, that people finally understood what had happened. I met my husband, Nathaniel, 2 years later at a mutual friend's wedding in Louisville, and I told him the story on our 3rd date because I decided early on that I would rather he hear it from me, plainly, than piece it together from rumor, the way half of Nashville once had. He listened without flinching, which is one of the reasons I married him. My mother-in-law, Geraldine, has never once brought it up in the 15 years I've known her, though I've always suspected she knows more of the story than she lets on. Geraldine tends to know things. My father-in-law, Harold, is the one who told me, the year Nathaniel and I got engaged, that a man who has to destroy someone else's name to protect his own was never worth fearing, only pitying, and I have tried, with mixed success, to believe him. We built our life in Louisville. Our daughter Nora is 15 now, sharp and skeptical in the particular way teenagers get when they've watched their mother handle other people's crises for a living and privately wonder who handles hers. Our son, Elijah, is 8 and still young enough to believe his mother can fix anything, which is its own kind of pressure some mornings. I built an entire career on the far side of what happened in Nashville until 3 weeks ago, when a folder crossed my desk with no name on the outside and Warren Hollister's failing heart on the inside, and asked me, of all the people left in his life, to be the one who decided whether it kept beating. I did not sign the form that first night. I told the ethics committee I needed 48 hours to review the clinical merits properly, which was true, and also the closest thing to a lie I have ever told a room full of colleagues, because what I actually needed was time to figure out whether I could stand in the same building as Warren Hollister without my hands shaking the way they had the night I found his name above the signature line. I drove home and told Nathaniel, before I told anyone else, sitting at our kitchen island, long after the children were asleep. He didn't say much at first. He'd heard the Nashville story so many times over 15 years that he could probably recite the audit numbers better than I could, and I watched him arrive, in real time, at the same impossible math I'd been doing in the car. The man who nearly destroyed my career now needed my signature to survive his own heart failure, and the hospital's protocol committee had no idea whose names they'd just put on either side of that request. "You don't have to do this," Nathaniel said finally. "There has to be another cardiologist on staff who can review it." There wasn't. Not really. I was the only board-certified specialist in the state, credentialed for that particular compassionate use trial, a fact I'd been mildly proud of a month earlier and now felt like a trap built specifically around me. I told Nathaniel I hadn't decided anything yet. That was also, technically, a lie. Some part of me had already decided the moment I recognized the handwriting, and the rest of me was simply looking for a way to live with whichever decision I made. I requested Warren Hollister's full chart the next morning, using my administrative access rather than waiting for the blind review to formally reach me, which was against protocol, and which I did anyway. He'd been admitted 6 days earlier, under a different last name at first, his mother's maiden name, Dandridge, which the hospital had corrected once his insurance forced the legal name through, as though some part of him had known his real name might not open every door in this city the way it once had elsewhere. His daughter, Fiona Hollister, was listed as his emergency contact and primary decision-maker. No wife on file, no other family listed at all. I met Fiona in the hallway outside his room 2 days later, before I'd said a single word to him directly. She was maybe 30, exhausted in the specific way of someone who has been sleeping in hospital chairs, and she introduced herself before she recognized my name on my badge, and I watched her face change the moment she did. "You're Dr. Winters," she said slowly. "The Dr. Winters." I asked her what she meant by that, already suspecting the answer. "My father talks about you," Fiona said. "Not often, but when he does, he calls you the one mistake he never fixed." I did not know, standing in that hallway, whether that sentence was meant as an apology relayed secondhand, or a warning that he still believed his own version of events, or something else entirely I hadn't considered yet. I asked her what she meant, and she told me she didn't fully know either, only that her father had asked, specifically, weeks before any of this compassionate use paperwork existed, whether the hospital in Louisville he'd chosen for this trial happened to employ a Dr. Renee Winters, and had seemed almost relieved when the answer came back yes. I walked out of that hallway with more questions than I'd walked in with, and one certainty I hadn't expected to feel. Whatever Warren Hollister wanted from me, it was not simply a signature. That night, my daughter Nora found me still sitting at the kitchen table with the chart printout in front of me, long after I'd told her I was only finishing paperwork. She's 15, and she has inherited her father's habit of noticing exactly the thing you'd rather she didn't. "You've been staring at the same page for 20 minutes, she said, not unkindly, just observant in that particular teenage way that makes you feel studied. I told her it was a hard case. She asked, the way she asks about most things lately, whether hard meant medically hard or something else, and I didn't have an honest answer that felt appropriate to give an 8-year-old's older sister at 10 at night, so I told her the truth in the smallest possible piece, that someone from a long time ago, before she was born, needed my help, and I hadn't decided yet whether I was the right person to give it. She looked at me for a long moment and said, "Isn't that basically your whole job, though? Helping people, whether or not you like them?" I didn't have an answer for that either, not one I was ready to say out loud. I called my mother-in-law the next morning, mostly out of habit, because Geraldine has a way of asking one precise question that cuts through whatever fog I've built around a problem. She listened to the outline, a patient, an old colleague, a signature, without asking for details I hadn't offered, and then she said something I turned over for days afterward. "You don't owe a man your mercy just because he finally needs it, but you don't get to decide he doesn't deserve to live, either. Those are two very different things, Renee, and you're the only one who can tell which one you're actually deciding right now." I hung up the phone, unsure which one I was deciding, and unsure, honestly, whether I wanted to find out. I want to tell you I slept that night. I didn't. I lay awake, replaying the review board, hearing from 21 years earlier, in more detail than I'd allowed myself in years. The particular chair I'd sat in, the particular way the chairwoman had folded her hands when she read the findings aloud, the particular sound of Warren's voice saying he'd hoped it wasn't true. I hadn't realized how completely I'd filed that memory away until it came back whole, uninvited, at 2 in the morning, the week the man responsible for it needed something only I could give him. I spent the better part of a week avoiding room 519 while I quietly built a case for myself that recusing entirely was the only clean, defensible option. I drafted an email to the ethics committee twice, explaining the conflict of interest, and deleted it twice, because every version of that email sounded, even to me, like I was hiding behind a policy instead of admitting I was afraid of a conversation. I finally went in on a Thursday evening, after my last patient, still in my white coat, telling myself I was only there to review his cardiac rhythm strips in person. Warren Hollister was smaller than I remembered him, which surprised me more than it should have. 21 years does that to a person, and heart failure does it faster. He recognized me before I'd said a word, and for a long moment, neither of us spoke at all. "I wondered if you'd come yourself," he finally said, "or send someone." I told him I review every case on this protocol myself. It wasn't entirely true, and we both knew it. What followed over the next several visits was not the confession I'd spent 2 decades imagining, and not the plea for forgiveness either. Warren talked, in pieces, about the fund, about a gambling debt from that era he'd never disclosed to anyone at the hospital, about panicking when the audit date moved up 3 weeks, and realizing his own login would be flagged unless someone else's wasn't. He didn't apologize the way I'd rehearsed him apologizing in my head 100 times over the years. He explained himself, carefully, like a man defending a decision rather than confessing a sin, and twice he used the phrase, "You understood eventually, didn't you?" as though my exoneration a year later had somehow settled the debt between us evenly. I brought this to Nathaniel, and separately, on a Sunday visit, to Harold, who listened to the whole account without interrupting, and then asked me one question that stayed with me longer than anything Warren himself had said. Did he ever once say the word sorry, or only the word explain? He hadn't, not once, across 3 conversations. Meanwhile, a resident on my own service, a sharp, quiet second year, named Desmond Hackett, flagged something in Warren's insurance file that didn't sit right with him. and brought it to me privately rather than escalating it through channels, which I respected. The compassionate use trial Warren had been approved for was normally reserved for patients with no other treatment pathway available. Desmond had found, buried in an out-of-state file, the hospital's system had only partially imported, that Warren had been declined for a nearly identical transplant alternative protocol 18 months earlier at a hospital in Ohio, for reasons the Ohio file didn't fully specify, and that he had specifically requested transfer to Louisville after learning which hospital held his file, and, Desmond suspected, after learning which cardiologist worked there. I sat with that for 3 days before I understood what it meant. Warren Hollister had not landed in front of my signature by accident, and he had not landed there purely to be near an old colleague either. If the Ohio hospital had declined him for reasons buried deep enough that even our own system hadn't fully imported them, there was a real possibility Warren had chosen Louisville, and chosen me specifically, because he believed I would sign where someone else already hadn't. Not out of malice toward me this time, but because he assumed, correctly or not, that the woman he'd once framed would still feel enough guilt or obligation to approve what a more skeptical physician might refuse. I requested the Ohio records formally through the Interstate Medical Exchange, expecting a fight over privacy law, and getting almost none, because Fiona, when I asked her permission, as his listed decision-maker, signed the release before I'd finished explaining why I needed it. "I want to know too," she told me. "He's never once told me the real reason Ohio said no." The records arrived 4 days later, and what I found in them was not the outright fraud I'd half-braced for. It was worse, in its own quiet way, a note from an Ohio cardiologist stating that Mr. Hollister had, in that physician's clinical judgment, misrepresented the severity and timeline of a prior cardiac event in order to qualify for a trial with a shorter wait list, and that the discrepancy had only come to light after a records request from a third party the file didn't name. Warren Hollister had shaded the truth about his own heart to move himself up a list once already, and now his life, quite literally, depended on whether I would extend him a benefit of the doubt he had never once extended me. I sat with those Ohio pages in my office long after my last patient had gone home, and Desmond knocked quietly on my doorframe before letting himself in. He's the kind of resident who reminds me of myself at his age, before Nashville, before I learned that hospitals protect their own reputations before they protect the people inside them. I wasn't trying to build a case against him, he told me, almost apologetically, as though flagging a discrepancy in a patient's file were something to feel guilty about. I just noticed the transfer request had his old hospital's name misspelled twice in a way that looked deliberate, like someone typing carefully around something. I got curious. I told him he'd done exactly what a good physician should do, and I meant it, though I also recognized, watching him second-guess himself in my doorway, a version of the caution I'd carried out of Nashville myself, the instinct to apologize for noticing something true. I called an old colleague from residency that same week, a woman named Priscilla Farley, who'd been a junior nurse on the cardiac ward the year of the audit, and had since become a nurse manager 2 states away. We hadn't spoken in over a decade. She remembered the fund shortfall clearly, she told me, and she remembered something else too, that Warren had asked her, weeks before the audit ever happened, whether resident login credentials could be used by administrative staff in a pinch, framing it as a hypothetical about hospital efficiency. She hadn't thought anything of it at the time. She'd never been asked to testify to the review board, because no one had ever asked her anything at all. Nobody asked the nurses, Priscilla said quietly. Nobody ever does, until it's too late to matter. I thanked her, and sat with that sentence longer than I expected to, because it explained something about my own case that I'd never fully understood. That an entire ward full of people had known small pieces of the truth, and none of them had been asked to assemble it before it cost me a year of my life. Fiona found me in the hospital cafeteria 2 days after that, holding a tray she hadn't touched. I keep trying to decide if I'm supposed to hate you for taking this long to sign, she said, sitting down across from me without asking. And then, I remember, he's the reason you're taking this long at all, and I don't know who I'm supposed to be angry at anymore. I told her she wasn't required to be angry at anyone, least of all herself, and that some situations simply didn't come with a clean villain and a clean victim laid out the way we wish they did. She looked at me for a long moment and said, quietly, that she'd spent her whole childhood believing her father was the victim of a coworker's jealousy, and that she wasn't sure yet what it would mean to stop believing that. I left the cafeteria that afternoon and sat in my car in the parking garage for longer than I care to admit, because Fiona's sentence had landed somewhere I hadn't braced for it to land. I had spent 21 years thinking of myself as the only person Warren Hollister's lie had damaged. Sitting there, I understood for the first time that he'd damaged his own daughter too, quietly, over decades, by handing her a story with the wrong person cast as the villain, and that unwinding it now, this late, might cost her more than it had ever cost me, because I'd at least always known the truth about myself. Fiona had spent 30 years not knowing the truth about her own father at all. By the time I drove home that evening, I had made a decision about at least one thing, even if the larger question of the signature still sat unanswered. Whatever I chose to do about Warren, I owed Fiona the full truth, plainly, the same way I'd once wished someone in Nashville had owed it to me, instead of letting a review board decide it for everyone else in the room. I confronted him with the Ohio file on a Tuesday, alone, no committee present, because I owed myself that much before I brought it to anyone else. Warren went very still when I set the papers on his tray table, and for the first time since I'd walked back into his life, he didn't have an explanation ready. I didn't lie about how sick I am, he said quietly. I'm dying, Renee. That part was never the lie. Then what was? He told me, finally, the timeline, that his symptoms had actually started nearly 2 years earlier than his Louisville chart reflected, and that he'd downplayed the onset date in Ohio to qualify faster for a program with a shorter wait. The same way, I realized with a cold, specific clarity, he'd once shaded a different set of records to protect himself at someone else's expense. The pattern wasn't a coincidence 21 years apart. It was simply who he was, under enough pressure, in any decade. But there was a second thing in that Ohio file, one Desmond had flagged almost as an afterthought, that mattered more than the falsified timeline. The Ohio cardiologist's note referenced a prior institutional matter in Tennessee that Warren had allegedly cited, unprompted, during his own consultation there, as the reason he no longer trusted hospital administration to keep his health information confidential. A level of paranoia the Ohio doctor found clinically unusual enough to document. Warren Hollister had spent 21 years still talking about Nashville, not to apologize, to explain, apparently to strangers, why he no longer trusted the very systems he had once manipulated. I asked him directly, in that room, whether he had ever told anyone the truth about the audit, that it had been him, not me. He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that I thought he might simply let the silence answer for him, the way he'd let a printed log answer for him 21 years earlier. "I told my ex-wife," he finally said, "the year we divorced. I told her because I needed someone to know I wasn't the man the hospital thought I was pretending to be. I was worse. I never told Fiona. I let her grow up believing her father was simply someone a jealous coworker once tried to smear." Fiona was standing in the doorway. She had come to bring him water and had been standing there longer than either of us realized. I watched her face while her father finally, 21 years too late, said my name out loud in the correct order. Not the woman who was investigated, but the woman I framed. Fiona didn't cry. She set the water down slowly, looked at her father for a long moment, and asked him the only question that mattered to her. "Does Dr. Winters know you asked to come here specifically because of her?" He nodded. "Then you'd better hope," Fiona said quietly, "that she's a better person than you were." She left the room without another word, and Warren and I sat in a silence that felt different from every silence we'd shared before it. Not tense exactly, just finally, honestly empty of anything left to perform. "I used to imagine running into you," he finally said. "In an airport maybe, somewhere neutral." I had a version of an apology ready for probably 15 of those 21 years. I asked him why he'd never once used it, in all those imagined airports, in all those years he apparently carried it around. He looked at his hands for a long moment before he answered. Because saying it out loud would have meant admitting there was never a version of this where I was actually the one who got wronged, and I built an entire second life on believing there might still be one. I told him, as gently as I could manage, that I had spent those same 21 years building an entire career on the opposite belief, that the truth, given enough time, tends to surface whether or not anyone helps it along, and that I had chosen, somewhere in my 30s, to stop waiting for his apology in order to keep living my life fully. "I stopped needing you to say it," I told him. "Somewhere around the year Nora was born, I think. I just needed to stop carrying the version of me that was still waiting." He nodded slowly, and for the first time since I'd walked back into his hospital room, he looked less like the man who'd once stood so calmly in front of a review board, and more like exactly what he was now, an old man, out of explanations, running out of time to have this particular conversation with anyone at all. Before I left the room that evening, he asked me one more question, quieter than anything he'd said before it. "Do you think Fiona will ever look at me the same way again?" I told him honestly that I didn't know, that some things, once a daughter learns them about her father, simply become a permanent part of how she sees him, the way Nashville had become a permanent part of how certain people in that city would always see me, fairly or not. I told him that was a cost he'd earned the right to worry about only recently, 21 years after he should have started worrying about it, and that I couldn't do the worrying for him. He accepted that answer more quietly than I expected, and asked nothing else of me that night. I walked out to the parking garage afterward, and sat behind the wheel, without starting the car for a long time, turning over the strange shape of what had just happened. I had walked into that room 21 years angry, and I had walked out of it, for the first time, simply tired. tired in the specific way that comes after finally setting down something heavy you didn't realize you were still carrying every single day, everywhere you went, for over 2 decades. I did not decide that night, and I did not decide the next day either. I took the confession to the ethics committee myself, in full, including the falsified Ohio timeline, because whatever I owed Warren Hollister, I did not owe him my silence about a second deception layered on top of the first one. The committee's response surprised me. The falsified onset date did not disqualify him from the Louisville Protocol, since our trial's criteria were based on current severity rather than historical timeline, but it would be formally noted in his file, and Fiona was informed in full, as his listed decision-maker, of everything I'd found. That left exactly one open question, and it belonged to me alone. Nothing about the ethics committee's ruling required my personal signature specifically. A colleague could, technically, still take the case, though it would delay his treatment by the better part of a week he likely didn't have. I sat with that fact for 2 full days, turning over every version of what signing would mean and what refusing would mean, until Harold said something to me on a Sunday afternoon that finally settled it, not because it resolved my anger, but because it named it correctly for the first time. "You keep asking whether he deserves you saving him," Harold said. "That was never the question in front of you. The question is whether you still get to be the kind of doctor you've spent 21 years becoming, or whether he gets to take that from you too, the way he already took a year of it once before." I signed the form on a Thursday morning, alone in my office, before rounds. I did not tell Warren I'd made the decision until I walked into his room that afternoon, and when I told him, he didn't thank me the way I'd once imagined, in the angrier years, that he might grovel to be thanked. He simply nodded and said, quietly, that he supposed he'd never really believed I would, not after everything he'd done to make sure I never had a reason to. "I didn't do it for you," I told him, and meant it. "I did it because I refused to let what you did to me 21 years ago decide who I am today. That's the only part of this that was ever really mine to control." The surgery, when it came 3 weeks later, went as well as a procedure like that can go for a man his age, with a heart that damaged. He is alive as I tell you this, in a rehabilitation facility outside the city, and Fiona calls me sometimes, not often, mostly to ask questions about his recovery that have nothing to do with the past between her father and me. She has never once asked me to forgive him on his behalf, which I respect more than she probably realizes. I have not decided whether I've forgiven him myself, and I've stopped assuming that decision needs to arrive on any particular schedule. Some debts, I'm learning, don't close the way an audit does, with a final number and a stamp. They just get carried differently, a little lighter some years than others, and this year, for the first time in 2 decades, mine feels almost bearable to carry. Nathaniel asked me quietly, the week after the surgery, sitting together at our kitchen table, long after the children had gone to bed, whether I regretted signing. I told him I honestly didn't know yet, and that some part of me suspected I might not know for years, the same way I hadn't understood, at 22, how long a single false accusation could follow a person through every job interview and every hospital hallway afterward. What I do know is this. Nora asked me, a few weeks later, why I'd never told her the full Nashville story before, and I told her the truth, that I'd been waiting until I understood the ending myself before I handed her a story that didn't have one yet. She said that felt fair. Elijah, for his part, only wanted to know whether the man's heart was fixed now, the way an 8-year-old wants to know whether a story has a happy ending, and I told him it was fixed enough, which is often the most honest answer medicine can give anyone. I think about Priscilla Farley's sentence more than almost anything else that came out of these last few months. Nobody asked the nurses. Nobody ever does, until it's too late to matter. I've started asking, now, in a way I didn't always used to, not because it undoes what happened to me in Nashville, but because it's the only part of this entire story that was ever fully within my control to change going forward. Geraldine, of all people, was the one who said the thing that finally let me set this down for now, a few weeks after the surgery, over dinner at her house. "You spent 21 years wondering if he'd ever admit what he did," she said, passing a dish across the table like she was discussing nothing more significant than the weather. "He finally admitted it, to your face, in a hospital room, with his own daughter standing in the doorway. That's more than most people ever get. It doesn't have to feel like enough, but it happened, Renee, and you were there for it, and now it's yours to decide what to do with, instead of his." I didn't have anything clever to say back to that. I just nodded and passed the dish along and let that be the end of it, for that night at least. Harold caught my eye from the other end of the table and gave me the smallest nod, the kind he's given me at exactly the right moments for 15 years now, and I understood it, this time, as him simply saying he was glad I hadn't let Warren Hollister decide, twice in one lifetime, who I was allowed to become, or who I was still capable of becoming from here. I still don't fully know what I'd tell another woman in my position if she asked me whether I'd made the right call. Part of me believes signing that form was the most honest thing I've ever done, because it had nothing to do with him and everything to do with who I refused to become. Part of me still wonders, some nights, whether I extended a grace to Warren Hollister that the 22-year-old version of me, standing in front of that review board with no one believing her, never once received from anyone in that room. I'd genuinely love to know what you think. If you'd been sitting where I was sitting, that folder open on the table, his name above the line where yours was supposed to go, would you have signed it? Or would refusing to save him have felt like the more honest form of justice? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one, and I'm always curious where in the world this story finds you. So let me know the city or country you're watching from tonight. If Warren Hollister's story moved you even a little, do me a favor and tap that like button before you go, because it genuinely helps more people find these stories. If you know someone who's ever had to decide whether an old wound was theirs to keep carrying or theirs to finally set down, send this one their way. I have a feeling it'll land for them the way I hope it's landed for you. And if this is your first time hearing my story, I'd love for you to subscribe and turn on notifications, because Nashville was far from the only chapter I haven't told you yet, and my mother-in-law Geraldine has a few chapters of her own I still haven't gotten to. Please share your honest thoughts in the comments too, whatever they are. I'd rather hear a hard truth from you than a comfortable silence, because that's exactly the kind of silence that let Warren Hollister avoid accountability for 21 years in the first place. Turn on notifications too, if you haven't already, so you catch the next chapter the moment it goes live, instead of finding it weeks later in your feed. Until the next one, take care of yourselves and take care of each other.